This is the LatinNews Podcast. My name is Richard McCoy, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This week's very special episode, we're dealing with the situation in Nicaragua. Our very special guest is Dr. Manuel Orozco. He's a political scientist from Nicaragua. He's been at the Inter-American Dialogue for 23 plus years, and you can see all sorts of comments and articles from him around on all over the internet, all over, and commenting wherever it needs to be. So, Dr. Manuel Orozco, thank you so much for coming on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure because Nicaragua should be in the news more. Let's give a little bit of a background. In April 2018, Nicaragua's government, obviously the President Daniel Ortega and the First Lady Rosario Murillo, they began a greater crackdown on, and there was social unrest. I mean, major social unrest, killing 355 individuals between April 2018 and July 2019. And since then, they've been systematically dismantling further democratic institutions. It's been a policy of repression, dissent, human rights violations, and this then intensified with the November 21 elections, which, I mean, widely and thoroughly questionable elections, widely declared as a sham. Perhaps, Manuel, you could give us a bit more of an update.
I think fundamentally the update is that the situation in Nicaragua is getting worse. The main issue is not much, in my perspective, what the government is doing vis-a-vis of the concrete actions like expropriation of academic centers or personal property of businesses, or the incarceration of individuals, whether they are activists or not. But it's more fundamentally the reason why they are doing this type of actions, because any dictatorship and even democratic governments sometimes just transgress the rule of law and execute these type of things. But in the case of Nicaragua, you're dealing with a kind of tropical Taliban, in the sense that the power structure that prevails in the country was designed with the purpose to establish a political structure run by Rosario Murillo and Daniel Ortega, with the purpose to establish not just a dynastic regime, but also a new belief system, a creed that appears to be led by a clan within the tribal Sandinismo in a broader spectrum like that of the Nicaraguan society. So that effort has a philosophy based on creating obedience towards Mr. Ortega as the messiahs of the new Nicaragua, with the mantra of Sandinismo, Christianity, and socialism on the one hand, and also using the image of Hugo Chavez as the type of people and person that Ortega mirrors himself at. And so he's been paving this whole structure for the past 15 years. And this, in 2018, when he realized, in 2019, in fact, after the first stage of the crisis, he realized that he was not popular. They decided to accelerate this type of regime. And so all of these activities are a consequence of the need to have in place a power structure that is extremely isolating in the international scene, but also is completely anti-democratic, totalitarian, with all these religious tendencies. Some of them are even inherited or taken from the legacy of Muammar Gaddafi, which is Ortega's mentor. So the whole structure of expropriation, the elimination of civil society, the destruction of freedom of the press, as well as the persecution against religious leaders and followers in general, both evangelicals and Catholic, is part of the bigger scheme to establish this type of system in Latin America, in Central America.
I mean, fascinating commentary. You've mentioned Chavez, you've mentioned Gaddafi, you've called it a tropical Taliban, which I hadn't heard before. But put it into context, how has Ortega then managed to maintain the support of the military and the security forces? Because you'd think they'd be the first to turn on him.
Well, that's a very important point. The way the system has, they have crafted a political management system based on 4 or 5 different pillars. One is the repressive pillar. The second one is the mediatic one, very much similar to the Taliban. You know, the Ministry of Virtue in Nicaragua is led by the Ministry of Communications by Rosario Murillo.
Mm-hmm.
The third pillar is the economic infrastructure led by the head of the central bank and a few private sector operators. And the fourth one is the institutional makeup. Within the repressive regime, the police is the one that leads the main repressive apparatus. The military has taken on a sideline position that they are not going to become directly involved. And the hierarchy of the military is in full support with Ortega because they don't see an alternative to rebelling to him. Mm. They're afraid that the breaking up of the army will cause a civil war in the country. And so that moral hazard has basically kept them on a standing off position in this, and in that regard, they turn out to support Ortega, at least from a transactional perspective. Ideologically, there is no support. Economically, there is some clientelism on some members of the military, but institutionally, fundamentally, they try to not to be the direct repressive engine of the system. I think the way these things are going in Nicaragua, the army will have to move in the direction of leading or participating in the repressive apparatus because the circle of power is diminishing. And so the number of people that are prepared to do that are the ones who are more loyal. And that will involve some members of the army. But fundamentally, the police is in charge. Now, the police is an institution that is pseudo-military in the sense that many of the members of the police today are former members of the army. So the head of intelligence, for example, in the police is a former military official, and a few other people that are in the police right now.
So there is a possibility, as you say, that the army or key figures within the armed forces may start to speak out against this repression. You think that there's a possibility in the future?
No, I don't think there is a possibility that they will speak out because, well, there is a strong dissent. To put it bluntly, only 5% of the population actually is favorable of Ortega. And those are the pretty much loyalists. This clientelistic base includes predominantly people who are working within the military or the police or the public sector. But within that, the hierarchy, the decision makers, are split basically between giving their loyalty to Ortega or exiting. But there is no an exit alternative to them because the international community has not signaled any particular way to tell them, you know, if you leave, we can provide you with a safe haven. So they're staying entrenched, but they are not prepared at the same time as they see that there is a political succession of Ortega towards Rosario Murillo in the next couple of years or next year, in the sense that that succession gives anxiety to those who are in the dissent, and that anxiety might lead to some greater tensions. So the government, what it's doing right now is performing what is called purges against key individuals, key decision makers, in order to prevent a potential uprising within the regime.
So this purging, I mean, we're looking at, you know, since 2022, the legal status of more than 2,020 civil society organizations has been cancelled. That's over 3,400, I think, now, since 2018. There have been 12 universities closed. In February, there are 222 political prisoners expelled to the US, continued arbitrary detentions, and between September 2022 and July 2023, we're looking at almost 46,000 Nicaraguans applying for asylum in Costa Rica. I think we need to roll back and just say, how did this happen since he took power in 2007? It's been it's been a slow process. And if we compare to other, I mean, it's getting faster now, obviously, but if we compare to other countries in Central America, El Salvador has been a very rapid process towards authoritarian movement. But I mean, Ortega has taken his time, but then has moved into this more extreme phase of repression.
You know, the manifestations might be the same, but the context that defines the reasons why are different. And I think it's important to distinguish between Bukele and the radicalization in Honduras too.
Yes.
There is definitely sort of a roadmap that non-democrats or leaders not so prone to democracy are using, that is based on trying to absorb and get control of all political institutions while at the same time discrediting the opponents. And after you discredit them, you criminalize the rule of law. This is the rule book that many leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean have been using. So that includes, for example, the laws on NGOs, non-profit organizations, to prevent their autonomy and their independence. You also have greater scrutiny over the freedom of expression, the destruction of media operations in several countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. But in the case of Nicaragua, yes, the list is that, again, it answers to a more structured logic. We're talking about 29 out of 32 universities in Nicaragua that have been removed. We're talking about 4,500 nonprofit organizations out of 600 that were legally registered. And it was known before 2019, before the Foreign Agents Law was passed, that there were no more than 5,000 actually physically existing nonprofits. So you have eliminated practically legally 85% of all civil society organizations that are formally existing. You have also destroyed the private sector. The number of formal businesses in Nicaragua has dropped significantly from 170,000 formal businesses to 130,000 today. And when it comes to migration, yes, we're living under the politics of expulsion and exclusion. And between 2018 and 2023, we're talking about 850,000 Nicaraguans who have left the country. That's more than 12% of the population. So is it a humanitarian crisis? Well, I think it qualifies as one, but more importantly, it's, again, the rationale behind this process, because there is a perversity in migration that it's almost like it was by design prepared by Ortega to expel people and get them to send remittances. The dependence on remittances this year is going to be equal to 30% of the country's GDP. Nicaragua has become the most dependent on the most remittance dependent country in the Western Hemisphere, and one of the largest dependents in the world, in the top 5. Is more dependent on remittances than Haiti. And the political situation, the economic situation in Nicaragua is mirroring in terms of the deterioration to that of Haiti. Haiti's per capita GDP has increased from 2016 to 2022 from $1,400 per capita to $1,850. Nicaragua's GDP has remained $2,000 per capita in the past 6 years. It hasn't changed. So its dependence on remittances increases, its GDP performance doesn't change. It's getting closer to the conditions of a fragile state, a very fragile state, like that of Haiti or Afghanistan. So the speed of which definitely tells you more about the reasons why they want to accelerate the system to establish sort of an agrarian society that is very much isolated of the world, with a strange variant, which is so far the regime is leaving for the next 18 months the decision to touch any economic activity that is directly connected to the global economy. So they are not touching exchange policies so far significantly. They are not having controls over foreign exchange. They are not touching the free trade zone. They are not touching any type of trading activity and still welcome foreign investment. Of course, judicial security is so low that foreign investment is not increasing, it's actually going down. Free trade zone activity has declined. The number of companies have dropped, has left the country. But Ortega is not going to touch them because he knows that if he touches the world, then the world is going to react. The question is, why is the world not reacting given the magnitude of repression that prevails in the country?
Well, this is the question, isn't it? It's will the US, for example, make good on its threat to suspend Nicaragua from the free trade agreements there? Will the government of President Biden, do you think, move forwards on this?
I think it's very difficult to say yes, because there are a number of reasons that don't help. First of all, from technical standpoint, you cannot suspend a country under the treaty of CAFTA. What you can do is impose penalties based on violations to some of the trading chapters. For example, violations to the labor and the environment agreements, chapter 16 and 17, for violations of market access among financial institutions of the United States into Nicaragua. That's chapter 12. There is significant control of the state over competitiveness in the financial markets. There is a law of consumer protection, but what the law does is to protect relatives of those who have been sanctioned. So there are restrictions on the amounts of remittances that you need to report, etc. So you can impose penalties on that, and that's an important element to do, and pressure that needs to be done. But the administration this time, is very reluctant at imposing sanctions in general, because there is a sort of a political risk embedded to sanctions today that is very high, because they don't see results. The assumptions on sanctions were the wrong ones, were not very accurate, and so you have some policy failures on the sides of sanctions, and that has turned people to look elsewhere in terms of foreign pressure. And I think the administration doesn't understand the magnitude of the problem in Nicaragua, as well as they are simply distracted by the amount of problems that are taking place. The threat that Russia and China represent to the United States is a global one. In military and economic terms, it's a significant threat that distracts the attention of policymaking. The problems in Latin America have also put Nicaragua almost in a fifth place. You have the Haitian crisis of the deepening criminality in the country, the disarray that takes place, followed by the Guatemalan political crisis that Giammattei is making sure that Arevalo arrives to power very weak. And then in third place, you have competing political crisis between Ecuador and Peru. So in fifth place, you have Nicaragua. And so that makes it harder for the administration to exercise some sort of political clout. And there is another reason, is that the foreign policy makers of this administration are trying to deal with complex cooperation, but with cooperative partners. But today you're dealing on complex cooperation realities with non-cooperative and authoritarians. And so your way of how to bang the table against these authoritarians requires some lessons and experiences from the Cold War. But this is a generation of people who did not grow up during that time. So it makes all of this complicated, and the administration is dealing with more domestic policy pressures. A Republican party that wants inward focus, not outward focus. They just, the last bill that postponed the whole fiscal budget approval did not include support for Ukraine, for example. And so what you have is just a situation where it's difficult just to make policy on Nicaragua.
When you talk about the lessons that we need to take from the Cold War, what exactly are you talking about?
Well, fundamentally, there are two lessons. One is that needs to be better prepared on how to deal with authoritarians who are risk acceptant when it comes to continuing the regime status and repressive apparatus. But that means that you need to consider a proportional response to the coercive nature of those regimes. And that includes coercive policies that, while they may not be of a military nature, they need to really tackle the vulnerabilities of these autocrats. And one of the major vulnerabilities are in the media, the control of disinformation, the control of trolls, the hacking that they perform. Those measures need to be addressed, and you need to dismantle the propaganda infrastructure that rules. The second one is that the average citizen that lives in the societies do not want those autocrats, do not want those totalitarians. And we need to have the conviction that the democratic values that shape the political institutions in the democracies that we live need to be not only enforced, but also provided as a mirror image to those nations that are suffering violations, so that the people see that they are not alone. And I think we have missed that element. You know, the administration has had the Summit of Democracies, but it's more like a conference event than an event that demonstrates how do we strengthen democracy? How do we address the weaknesses of the rule of law? And it is a key issue because the administration made as a goal to promote democracy and defend it. But we actually see a higher increase of authoritarians who do not buy into the US commitment towards democracy in the world. So we have to be prepared to meet the risks and the challenges that these dictators are putting in front of you and draw the line. And there are ways to draw the line. You have these coercive measures, but you also have to be realistic within the context of a country like China that is basically selling its image of being an authoritarian regime, a totalitarian system that tells you that it's okay to be bad, but it's okay to do business with anyone. And that's the image that is selling in the world in exchange of diplomatic recognition. And I don't think we are very much aware of the threat that China represents in the world in that regard, because at the end of the day, democracy, the absence of democracy is a complete obliteration of human values and human development.
And there was a free trade agreement just signed with China between the government of Ortega as well.
Yes, which is just a sort of a footprint for the entire Latin American region. China, it's growing in terms of its trade presence, more in terms of its exports to Latin America. 20% of imports of Central American from China, of goods from the world in Central America come from China, is going to surpass the United States as a major importer of goods. But it's more than that. It's the geopolitical significance that China wants to have in the Americas, including the sale and use of 5G technology for the benefit of the regime.
So, I mean, when you look at that, it's China, also Russia, of course, in this great chess game about the geography needed, the geopolitics. What is the relationship that Nicaragua and the regime has with Iran at the moment?
It's an ideological solidarity-related type of approach. They embrace the belief that Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, and Venezuela, as well as Cuba, in that order, are countries that are basically presenting themselves publicly as diametrically opposed to the United States. Okay. And Ortega is implicitly saying that they are of the same position. And the reality is that they are not saying it only for the purpose to say we're a regime under siege by the United States. They are saying that what the US represents is not the type of system that they value.
Okay. Okay. But I mean, all of this leads, and what one hopes, to dissent. When we think realistically about this, but are there any signs of dissent from within, or is the opposition all just based overseas now?
The opposition is, I mean, the leadership of the period between 2018 and 2021 is in exile. There is obviously also a critical mass of Nicaraguans who not only not support the regime, is 9 out of 10 people, but there are some individuals who quietly are resisting the infrastructure, the political makeup of this regime. And they may play an important role at some point to address this, but not for now. I mean, the culture of fear that the regime has established is overwhelming. Yeah. There are 20,000 police officers in the country. There is one police practically per every 100 homes. So you are living on a policing state, not including the role of the army.
So, I mean, so we're not going to see any challenges to the regime?
Challenges are. There are challenges against the regime. There are transnational political groups that are operating in networks between Nicaragua and other parts of the world that engage in different type of resistance activities. But again, the way you have to work this has to be done within the context of countries like Afghanistan, like Syria, even like the Gulf countries, where the possibility of social protest is not an option. So you look for alternatives to social protest, street protest, that can have an effect in the vulnerabilities of the regime.
Okay. So, I mean, we're talking about them. Okay, so there are challenges that are available, the regime, but it's pretty firmly entrenched. And are we looking at a successor in their son, Laureano?
We're looking at the successor that is going to be his wife. Okay. There is a political debt that Ortega owes to Rosario in exchange of her loyal support to keep him in power practically 4 consecutive times, 3 consecutive times plus the times in the 80s. And basically, the plan is to hand out power to her in 2025. So she can have an entire year to promote her time for the next election period and then take over. The dissent is feeling anxious about that succession because they don't buy into the selection process, which is very unilateral. Yeah. They don't buy into the individual who's being chosen. Rosario Murillo is not very much liked, even though the past 2 years they have changed different parts, different features that are more of her side than the Sandinista group. And so that has been an effort to contain the dissent, but it's still strong. I would say that at least half of people within the circle of power are uneasy about Rosario. And once she's in power, there will be more reluctance to work with her. So it remains to understand what is the nature of that political composition, how strong the balance of power is on the side of her. But we're talking about 2027 onward. By that time, conditions in Nicaragua will really be in bad shape.
Yeah, I mean, we can't talk about cracks in the system when Rosario comes into power, because as you say, 2027, if things continue as they are, I mean, you said that 12% of the country in recent years has left. I mean, it beggars belief what might actually happen. This huge migration leaving the country into Costa Rica and beyond, obviously going north, how is this affecting the relationship with neighboring countries in Central America?
Well, it's affecting it in absolute terms, in practical terms, that there are more people going through the border. But there are two important issues. One is that when the Biden administration introduced the humanitarian parole mechanism in January of 2023, it cut migration, basically. It contained Nicaraguan migration. The number of Nicaraguans living through the border basically dropped to less than 1,000 a month, from 35,000 in December 2022. So instead of the administration addressing the problem in Nicaragua from a foreign policy angle, it just decided to contain migration and let those people deal with the conditions in their home country by themselves. And migration has not increased to Costa Rica this year. It has remained in a stable number of less than 5,000 refugee applications per year, which is per month, which is a large number. We're talking about 60,000 applications. But it was 8,000 last year. Okay. And also the net entry of Nicaraguans to Costa Rica has remained at less than 500 people per month. Okay. Then to the US, you see a decline. Even through the parole, less than 40,000 people have been admitted through the parole throughout most of the year. You could have had at least 100,000 people, at least, coming to the US at this time. And the main issue is that there is a depopulation variable, that so many people have left that you don't have as much as a larger room for other people to live, because their obligations to stay are too strong. For example, a person that could live but has to take care of a relative or a minor and is not prepared or cannot afford to go in family out of the country. And especially given the restrictions that exist today.
Yeah. We have to continue on the issue of Central America as we wind this down. As you said, the problems that Bernardo Arevalo is going to face, and the corporate authoritarian elite in Guatemala, the strong hand of Xiomara Castro growing in Honduras. Obviously, it needs no publicity what is going on with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Can we expect, or can we just hope, that the presidency of Costa Rica and Rodrigo Chavez steps up to become, the voice of diplomacy in the region?
No, no, unfortunately, no. I think we may expect the voice of President-elect Arevalo to play a leading role, and maybe Costa Rica followed through. When you think of Central America, you can no longer think only of the 5 countries, but you need to include Belize, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. And these are very important countries. Belize and foreign policy has been reluctant to continue sort of lining up with Nicaragua. It actually has been more towards the position of strengthening democratization efforts in the region. Then you have a situation of what is called the Alliance for Development in Democracy. That includes the Dominican Republic and Panama with Costa Rica. They have a predominantly economic strategy to address, attraction of foreign investment, etc. But they do have also a foreign policy perspective to look into the threats of political regimes that might not be democratic. And I think Costa Rica is prepared to get into the bandwagon of international pressure during this government if the other partners join in.
Okay.
And I think we're likely to see some important steps in that direction. But you have to understand also the nature of political developments taking place in Central America. You know, the threat of Martinelli winning politics has led to a political coalition of parties aligning against in the election against him. You also see a new political movement in the Dominican Republic forming a coalition of parties in order to secure a new transition. And even in Honduras, there is a coalition building established against Libre, against Zelaya and Castro, in order to prevent the radicalization of Zelaya in that country. And then you have Guatemala. Guatemala will have a difficult ruling space, but it will ensure certain policy gains. And I think that's a key issue to see how it unfolds. And even in El Salvador, Bukele will win the election. He will leverage his popularity to be reelected, but his policy performance hasn't been that successful. He has leveraged on the anti-crime period at the time when the gangs were weakening. But his economic performance is lousy. He is not delivering. And El Salvadorans will realize that it's the economic stupid.
It's the economic stupid, as you say. So listen, let me take this moment to say thank you so much for your time and your profound insights into Nicaragua and, of course, beyond into the region, because, you know, connecting Belize into this, connecting the Dominican Republic, and, of course, much overlooked in this area. We forget Panama, but the elections coming up are very important. So thank you so much to Dr. Manuel Orozco of the Inter-American Dialogue, political scientist from Nicaragua, based in the United States. It has been a revealing, somewhat negative, I think, outlook on everything if we think about what's going on in Nicaragua, but we hope for the best in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to Dr. Manuel Orozco. This has been the LatinNews Podcast dealing with Nicaragua this week. I've been Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.